Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Melanie Bennet and Shannon Douglas. Both Melanie and Shannon are parents who are concerned about a lot of the quote unquote wokeness, I guess especially the gender ideology. Melanie's also a podcaster, and Shannon, I believe you also record with Melanie as well.
Yeah, we co-host a podcast called the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. I was doing that as a blog for most of this year, up until when did we start? Late August, Melanie.
I think it's been
I
about 5 weeks.
Yeah, I invited Melanie to help me take go from a blog to a video podcast, and we're now doing the weekly live on Sunday afternoons about the emerging stories in the gender wars in Canada. I've been following this closely for the last 2.5 years. So um, that's a lot of content for people who might just be figuring out what's going on in schools, um, and their awareness is raising, and they want to understand what's happening at kind of at a deeper level and some of the big news.
Wait, actually, what you mentioned there, people only just starting to realize it. So I'm gonna I'm gonna put on my tinfoil hat and give you like a little scenario that you might think is something that something in the way of sort of what happened. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard of an organization called Free Range Kids. Uh, and they also have a thing called Let Grow. It started out in the States, and I know Lenore was trying to get some chapters in Canada. And it's basically just helping kids get confidence, and they go to a school and they get all the kids in that school to agree, or they get a neighborhood of parents to agree. If you see my 10-year-old walking to the store, don't call the cops on him. That kind of stuff. So it's just to get kids to make breakfast one day. They're a big, huge advocate for free play. And I bring that up. I'm going to start with that and then come on down to where we are. And, you know, I think we're all roughly about the same age, all Gen Xers. And if you think back to the late 80s, early 90s, the stranger danger, all that
Yep.
kind of stuff, it got more and more oppressive. And parents had less and less time to actually do anything because you're ferrying your kids everywhere. You can't leave your kids alone. So that was one aspect of it. Parents didn't have time, but then all this woke stuff came out of the universities, started coming into the schools, and that's where the teachers were learning. So that's how they started teaching kids. And so until COVID, I think there was a huge chunk of time where parents didn't know what was going on in their kids' schools and didn't know what was being taught. And I think the two kind of go hand in hand. That's why I was like saying like my little tinfoil hat. Like you had on one side, you had all the safetyism where we have to protect the kids. We can't let them, parents out, can't leave them. And like some of the stories I was reading, mom going for a job interview at a hairdresser's, leaves her 12-year-old in the park across the street, and Child Protective Services gets called on her, and things like that. And then I was looking at this, I'm like, there's a lot to be fixed there. And not just one small part of this, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But so when you said, parents only really started waking up a couple of years ago, so do you think that part of the COVID lockdowns, whatever, was in some way a mixed blessing that parents got to see what was going on in their kids' schools and what they were learning before where they weren't really paying attention?
Well, first of all, I'm a millennial. I'm not
Oh,
a Gen
sorry.
Xer.
Sorry. Didn't
And
mean
I
to
could,
age you.
how dare you? Um, but I cannot, I can only speak for myself. I have an unusual story. So I was born in Canada. Actually, my family are from Montreal and Ottawa, but I spent most of my life in the UK. So I spent all my adult life in the UK. I was educated there. That is what I culturally identify as. And I took a job here six years ago and came with my son. And I can tell you that immediately when I got here, I could tell something was off. In fact, I remember telling my friends and family within months, thinking something a bit off about Canada. It's not what I remember growing up. I thought, okay, maybe it's because it's the GTA. It's not Montreal. I'm technically French Canadian and British. So yeah, it took me 6 years to figure out what the issues are. 6 years. So my story is a little different. I do think that many parents seem to have realized what's going on in the schools, definitely during the pandemic, or at least that's what I hear. So I don't know if we mentioned it in the introduction, but I'm also part of Our Duty Canada. So when I started realizing what the problems were, I started reaching out. Certainly felt a little bit isolated. So I joined Our Duty Canada, which is a parent sport organization. And that is an organization that has many parents who are in the same situation. Their families were affected negatively by the gender issues here in Canada. So and that's kind of where one of my podcasts is, the resilience on YouTube. I talk to some of these parents. I talk to all kinds of parents, educators about gender. So that is a recurring theme that I've come across. That is to do with the pandemic, increased use of the internet, specifically TikTok seems to come up quite a bit for the girls. I've had that over and over. I certainly found that with my own family, an increased use of internet. I started using TikTok during the pandemic and seeing all these trans videos, and even then it took me a while to figure it out. So yeah, I would say that from what I'm hearing, that's pretty common. I don't know about you,
Well,
Shannon. What do you think?
I am a Gen Xer, and I think I'm kind of square in the middle of Generation X, and we straddled, the analog and the digital age, right? I grew up very much a free range kid. I lived internationally on the coast of South America, and I was, well, my mother came from a fishing village in Newfoundland. My father was a farmer. The joke in the prairies is you can let the kids just go and you can see them 4 miles away because the land is so flat. And, sort of culturally, I had the ability to, I left the house in the morning with a pocket knife and a pack of matches and a fishing hook when we lived in Chile, and 5, 6, 7 years old, and we would forage our own lunch and cook it on the beach, and that was just sort of what you did. Small emerging economy town, 5,000 people, and I did my best to convey that, impart that to my own kids, that self-sufficiency and that self-reliance, which Canadians used to be known for. And now it's we've got this sort of, like you said, safetyism that's emerged in the last 10 years, quite frightening. And it gives what I think has happened is it's given school authorities a presumption of power that they are the protectors of children, and that the outside world is harmful and scary and not safe, and they have to put boundaries around those kids around based on the ideology that they've picked up in universities in the last 10 years and teachers college, and to extend that bubble wrap or that safetyism around kids, even in their own against their own families. There was a notice that went out today about a activist coming into Peel schools, I think it was, to teach about how Pierre Poilievre and Jordan Peterson and a number of others are white supremacists and basically evil, and to bring this into grade 7 classrooms in public schools. And this is an act that turns children against parents. People who come from a religious family, people whose families are traditionally conservative, are going to be learning in the state-sponsored education system that their parents are bad. We've just gone too far.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, the white supremacist extreme right, because not that anyone can see me, but anyone looking at me would probably place me firmly in the category of a progressive leftist, and I was pretty much my entire life. I worked in those kinds of areas. That's the circles that I functioned in. My friends and family certainly are, very strongly in that camp. And yet, the moment that you disagree with some of these things here in Canada, because I did put the brakes on some of those things when I got here, because Canada is very special in that way. I can tell you that much. I now get called a white supremacist, or I get called a conservative or an extreme right or things like that. And it's just confusing to me every time, because no one would ever put me in that category whatsoever. So how do you combat that? Who knows? But yeah.
Okay, that's the only reason I know anything about CRT, and it's the only reason I started reading some gender. I came back, so I spent I don't know, close to 13 years, I think, overseas working with the military. And I came back to Canada in 2014, and my last contract overseas was in Afghanistan. So I come back, and I come from a Muslim background, and I see all this stuff about Islam. I'm like, this is all wrong. And so I start criticizing things like the hijab. They'll say straight out that the Taliban and ISIS are firmly rooted in Islam. And yeah, I'm brown. I got called a white supremacist. So I mean, it just at that point, I'm like, okay, what's going on here? Why did it? Like, where does that come from? There's, in what world am I a white supremacist? And so even that, I mean, we look at, I don't care what you think of the man, but like Larry Ellison, oh, the black face of white supremacy. I mean, come on, it's just, the words have lost all meaning. Well, one of the things you mentioned, Shannon, little towns. Yeah, so growing up in Montreal, it's not actually a small town, but yeah, I was the same way. I was a latchkey kid. I'd come home on my own, like, first grade, let myself in, make myself a snack. On the weekends, go out, first thing in the morning, don't come back until the, street lights come on. But I spent 5 years in an Inuit community up in northern Canada. And there, small community. Kids are, especially in the summer when the sun's out till, sun rises at 2 and it's out till 11 at night. The kids are out all the time. And older kids are watching the younger kids, but it's not like there's even like 15-year-olds. They're all, I guess, like the oldest would be 12, they're down to like toddlers. And that's just normal. Come back to Montreal, just shocked to see that.
Well, that's how I was raised, millennial or not. I most definitely identify as a Gen X. There's no doubt about that. And I certainly was raised by a feminist who was very much into her job, so very much latchkey child also in Montreal. And I benefited from that. I think we all benefited from that to a certain extent. It certainly made us much stronger in character, I think more resilient than what we see. I tried to raise my own child that way. So my previous career, I guess, was an ecologist. I did tours of conservation, spent a lot of time outdoors, very, very, very environmental, very outdoorsy, climbing mountains, very adventurous person. So I tried to raise my son that way. And well, people have their own personalities, and he was much more like his father, much preferred being on the computer, but he would a little bit when he was younger. But as soon as we came to Canada, that just, I thought we'd come to Canada and it would be like when I was younger, we'd be able to enjoy the great outdoors with a bunch of people. And that kind of wasn't really the experience that I had. And he just seemed to regress even further. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily because of the schooling system, although, how much is the school, how much is natural? But I do often wonder, thinking back, how much of that really influenced a lot of the issues that we had. But yeah, I do feel like there's even if you don't raise your child in a way that is overprotective, because that's certainly not, I think we call it helicopter parenting. Like that's absolutely not the approach that I've ever taken. But I've tried to instill values like discipline and accountability and hard work and, having good relationships with people. But through that, in my time in Canada, I get called an abusive parent for doing that. So that I can squarely put some of the blame on the social influence of the education system here in Canada, without a shadow of a doubt.
Okay, I want to get to the education, but I just want to get your opinion on it. So you said you moved here 6 years ago, or moved back here 6 years ago. What do you think about what's going on in the UK? Because again, going back to the Islam thing, I was seeing all over Europe and in North America, like the discourse around Islam, and the whole grooming gang story started breaking around, around 2014. You had the whole Rockdale thing, I think, in 2015, where that first story came out. 1,500 girls in the Rockdale area and stuff like that. So
I can't answer that.
No,
I can't
but
answer that because all of the friends and family that I have in the UK, and that's pretty much where I got my news from and in stories or whatever, they're all what I would call woke. And so, right now I still have relationships with them, but it's strenuous at best. and I get called, I'm told I exaggerate. These people have known me my entire life. They know that I'm not homophobic or racist or anything like that. But because of the stance that I've taken, because I've seen Canada much further down the line in some of this thinking, because I see things that they're not able to see yet. Even my closest friends and family, which I had great relationships with, think I'm exaggerating or a little bit crazy or maybe possibly in a cult, or like I do get that. So it's hard for me to tell, because when I did hear the stories from them, I certainly never heard any of these. I never heard about grooming gangs. I never heard about any racism. I know I understand there's a lot of problem with mass immigration to the UK, which is causing an enormous amount of problem. But if I raise that, if I ask questions about that, there's a lot of defensiveness, as though I'm being very racist for bringing it up. So, I don't feel like I could possibly answer that. I know there's issues, but I can certainly say that the people that I know do not see it in the same way that you are. I think they see it from a woke perspective.
Okay, sorry. What I was trying to get at was, how do you see the UK now going woke? Because, okay, the stuff with Islam and whatever, not, maybe you can call it proto woke or whatever, but it wasn't really the same woke stuff that's going on now. Now you have BLM in the UK. Like,
I
would
think
you
the
see
UK is
that?
trailing. I think the UK is trailing behind us. I think I've been telling people Canada is the canary in the coal mine. And it's the canary in the coal mine, from my understanding, because the institutions are all absolutely captured in a way that, for example, in the UK, they're not. So for gender, for example, we've got that enshrined in law. And in the UK, they're trying to kind of remove gender from the law because they've pulled back, they've realized. But Canada's gung-ho. There's absolutely, I mean, I would like to see it removed from law, but it probably won't. And so it's a canary in the coal mine. We're worse. Now, whether or not people actually bother to see, and many people seem to. I know here in Canada, when it comes to gender, we look up to the UK saying, okay, well, if they're able to put a halt on these things, maybe we will as well. But our laws are different. So I don't know. Some people see it, some people don't. It's hard for me to. I've been here 7 years. I've barely been back. So, all I really know is what I read in the paper and the
I
discussions
think
that
in
I have
some
with
ways,
family.
Melanie, that the UK is leading rather than trailing. And I understand where you're coming from when you say it's
Leading maybe in that, but trailing in terms
thinking.
of people's
Yeah.
understanding of the
Well,
problem, for
there's
sure.
been good pushback in the UK for a few years, and there's been good legal precedents set,
Yes.
cases argued. The Maya Forstater case in the UK was very important, where it ended up that I don't know the specifics of the law, but basically they said that believing that there are two sexes is a protected belief. Right. You can't discriminate against
Yeah.
somebody because they believe in biology, but it was touch and go there for a while. And in Canada, we
Yes.
don't have that. So, there was this incursion of wokeness, especially in the trans area that I've been following. And UK seems to have been able to inoculate itself a little better than the rest of the world. I think there were people who saw the problem earlier. There were people who spoke out against the problem,
Yeah.
and it hadn't entrenched itself so deeply that it couldn't be unwound. So in some ways they are leading.
I think you're describing what
Yeah,
I'm saying in a different way, because that's the thing. So living in the UK, we could see American problems. We could see American. So this is really an American problem. And so we saw that, and there's some kind of importation of American culture, but it's not the way it is here in Canada. Like, Canada absorbs American culture in a way that the UK doesn't. And so there's always going to be some barrier between what's happening here in North America and it being exported over there. So that's kind of what I mean. Like, Canada's way worse, way more forward, and the UK went, oh, whoa,
yeah.
okay.
I,
So anyway, that's my
I don't
interpretation
know
of it. I
so
think we're
much
sort of
about
saying
the
the same thing.
race issue because, from my understanding, we have an example. I think it was Philadelphia last week. Anyway, there was a major city in the U.S. where there was organized looting. And the windows
Mhm.
breaking, this was not a small number of people, and the news media all reports that these were looting gangs. Okay, but no one reports that these were Black Americans. You're not allowed to say it, and you're not allowed to say that for example, in Ottawa we've got a large Somalian community, and there are lots of great people from Somalia. They've come here under hardship. And there are a lot of young Black men from Somalia who didn't grow up with the rule of law like we did, who don't understand that we live by a rule of law. and they've created a diaspora that's violent, and that crime is sort of a part of the culture, but no one's allowed to say that there's a specific place of origin, that there are specific a specific race involved, because that's racism. So the media won't report it, because that would be to violate whatever codes of talking about race that we have instantiated in journalism. And now I believe, and I don't know a ton about the grooming gangs, but I believe that was part of the problem, that there was a public sort of taboo about speaking about certain communities and what was going on in certain communities. And so no one could talk about it. No one, if you can't define the problem, you can't solve it.
Yeah, that's what I have with my family. I'm not allowed to talk about certain things. That's definitely the feeling I get. Yeah. Even on a personal level.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the grooming, I don't want to devolve into the talk of the grooming gangs. Okay. When you mentioned that, one of the reasons it broke was that a sick family, or a few sick families, their daughters were targeted and they spoke out. And so they weren't listening to it when it was white working class British people. But when it was, British, like British people from a Sikh origin or Sikh immigrants, then now it's like, okay, well, which brown person do we believe? And that's what it basically came down to. And that's what really broke the story around 2014 or 15. I can't remember the exact year, but the Rockdale story broke out. But yeah, so that's how the grooming gang thing broke. And that's the only reason I knew anything about it, was because these Sikh families went up and they said, okay, this has happened. And then you had the whole thing kind of blow up. Like I said, the first story that I read was 1,500 girls in the Rockdale area. I mean, that was over a period of, I believe, 10 years, but still, that's 150 girls a year.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
It's interesting that communities of Muslims and Sikhs and other visible minorities in Canada have been the ones to really, I mean, the million-person march was suddenly couldn't be criticized as white supremacist working class Canadians. This was all of a sudden there's actually minority groups that are affected by this, and the weapons that the woke use to distort reality to other people, to shut down conversations, and to minimize what people's concerns are, those tools were suddenly taken away from them, and the media is floundering around because they don't know what to make of this.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, like, so if you want to talk about what's going on in schools, go ahead, and then like I said, I'll give you my thoughts about Islam more, but like the pushback coming from like the Muslim and the Sikh communities and stuff like that. I'm a little wary of some of the Muslims that are, like I said, I'd really like to know what's going on in the schools and what you're seeing, because I'm an outsider looking in. I don't have kids. I got into this with the race thing, and I just looked at all of it. I'm like, this is all nuts. This is all liberal. This is denying reality. And I'm being a little selfish. I'm close to whatever, 10 years before I retire. I want the people looking after my pensions to know that 2 + 2 does not equal 5. I want my doctors picked based on their qualifications, not because of the same skin colors. I want the person giving medical advice shouldn't be able to tell me that men can get pregnant. So that's where I'm coming from on this. It's purely selfish on this thing. So, like I said, if you guys want to talk about the schools, like I'd really love to do that for a little bit.
I mean, the long and the short of it is, I think every single school board in Ontario has doubled down, really. And double down on what? Double down on the idea that the Million Marches specifically were about LGBTQIA plus other letters hate. It was all about hate, and I think that's the approach that they've sort of taken on that particular thing. So I'm not in schools. My son is grown up and moved out. It seems to me that when it comes to the schools, and Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems to me, although the school boards really take a strong stance in defending SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity type of policies, that it really depends on the school, and it really depends on the principal, and to some extent I think it really depends on the individual teachers, who, from my understanding, have quite a bit of autonomy. So my son was at the York Region District School Board, come to find out after that was all finished that it's probably one of the worst. But then again, maybe they're all the worst here in Ontario. Who knows? But yeah, I just feel like a lot of them really are hopping onto this idea that it's just a rising tide of hate, and all of these regular parents, all of these individual people with a diversity of thought, a diversity of religion, diversity of ideas, diversity of backgrounds, and diversity of race and ethnicity, and all so on and so forth, are just a sudden rising tide of homophobic hate. So, I mean, that's what I'm getting. It feels like they're so close and yet so far from understanding why parents
one
are
of the
upset.
things, and Michael Schellenberger and Peter Boghossian released something today, which is a chart about the personality disorders and how different types of personality disorders scale within systems, and how it operates on different levels. It's going to be really interesting to look at. What we have is a distributed kind of narcissism. And in that cluster B personality disorder set of categories, I'm using some outdated language, but psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, borderline personality, histrionic. These people don't have empathy, and they can't see themselves in the mirror. They're like a vampire. They cast no reflection that they can see. So they're incapable of seeing the impact of the actions and policies that they're implementing as causing any problems. They believe entirely that they're virtuous and that they're here to save the world, which is what I understand is teachers' colleges for not a short period of time, like a couple of decades, have been trying to attract teachers to the profession to shape the next generation, right? And what we have now is a system that's so entrenched in an ideology that basically they're training child soldiers in the social justice crusade. And they'll alienate children from their families and their parents and raise up this animosity and this resentment and this bitterness and this fear about the state of the world, which is completely illusory. It's fake, right? And yet these kids are charged up and they're ready to go take on the world. The unions across the country, the teachers' unions, Ontario Teachers Union says it's a social justice organization. And so they're teaching they're proliferating social justice through their members. The Elementary Teachers Federation, the same thing. All these organizations self-identify as social justice organizations, and their roles are to train social justice children. And they're using more sophisticated tools than kidnapping children from their villages and giving them guns and making them shoot their parents. But they're creating child soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I call them woke madrasas, and I mean, like the example I use is, you go to Pakistan, and not every kid that goes to madrasa is going to join ISIS. But if you take a poll in the UK and other parts of Europe, I think it's something like 95% plus criminal offense. They're not going to go out and kill the apostate. They're not going to throw homosexuals off a cliff or off a tall building like ISIS was, but they'll want to lock them up because they got that. They got that mentality. That's the lens, the way they see the schools. And something you did mention, Melanie, like it's up to the teacher, it's up to the principal. There's a guy in the States, Robert Condicio. He wrote a really good book, like How the Other Half Learns, but he's been in education for a while, I think like 20 years. And he, like I talked to him about that. Now he's more working on the other side of things. And he's talking about like there is no, like I talk about, I read the curriculums, I read some of the things that are posted by a lot of people like both of you, John Kay or Chanel, I'll post like the different curriculums, and I take a look at what's being taught in the schools. But he was saying like the classroom is more or less a black box, so it's up to the teacher to a certain degree. And that's what I was trying to convince to some people. I said it doesn't matter if you know what the curriculum is if you don't know what the lesson is. I said you could look at the curriculum, like it's a 9th grade English class, they're reading Huck Finn. Oh, great, Huck Finn, good book. I read it. 9th grade, it's a good book for them to read or whatever. I always use this as an example, but if you have a quote unquote woke teacher who's looking at through the lens of CRT, you can turn Huck Finn into a woke lesson, and you can talk
100%.
about how Huck was using Jim's emotional labor, and then Huck goes back to, and then he makes himself out to be a white savior by letting Jim go, but he doesn't learn anything because he goes back to his life of privilege. Now you can turn that book
You know,
into that kind of
that's
lesson.
problematizing,
So,
right?
you know,
That's critical
yeah,
consciousness.
and it's
Yeah.
yep.
There was a really neat.
So how much of that is
There
in the
was a really neat.
schools? Sorry,
This
go
ties
ahead.
to what you're saying. Article that came out on Monday in the Ottawa Citizen. What do kids learn about gender diversity in schools? And it was a lengthy piece. I printed it out, and it's 13 pages. And there's some images there as well. But I've been studying school policy for a couple of years, trying to understand what's going on. And I figured out a while ago that it's not the curriculum. Like, how is it? How is this happening in classrooms? And one of the standard responses, and not long ago I heard somebody on CBC. It was a lunchtime call in about gender ideology in June, I think it was, and this was a teacher and and a DEI consultant or trainer or what have you, that their lead for the school, saying, well, it's not in the curriculum. We don't teach about gender until grade 8. So why are people so up in arms about this? It's not in the curriculum. And then what this reporter has put out, and the Ottawa Citizen's a Post media property, and even though the National Post has a conservative editorial stand, the Ottawa Citizen editors are very woke. Um, they acknowledge at length that it's not in the curriculum, that it's in the policies, and that teachers have all kinds of autonomy to teach what they want. And they brought in so-called experts from the gender studies department at Queen's and a specialist in education talking about how important it is for inclusion and all of these things, and that teachers have a large degree of latitude. Um, and no one, I wrote the editors yesterday to say, like, there's no accountability here. There's no benchmarks to measure how this is being deployed. There's no metrics to say whether this is working or not. It's being given to kids, and normally with the sex ed curriculum, which people are still have their minds wrapped around that this is sex ed curriculum, and what's going on, how has this jumped out of sex ed? Well, it's deliberately been moved out of sex ed through these policies, and deliberately done in a way that escaped public scrutiny. Every time we have a sex ed conversation about curriculum, it's a huge deal in Ontario, in BC, anywhere in Canada. And there's all kinds of stakeholders that get involved. But these activists have decided, well, a good way around this is to make these policies, and we'll call them human rights policies. Okay. And they say this is all about human rights, but a human rights policy has no weight of law. It's not a law, it's a policy. And the school board policies about inclusion and gender and diversity, equity, are policies based on policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, not laws. And they're not written by lawyers. They're written by DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucrats and consultants for the school. So there's nothing. This is just being driven by a small group of people who want to impose their view on the world. And they use these tactics of othering, calling people white supremacists and bigots and hateful and all the names to shut people down. They've been extremely successful at it for the last couple of years as individual parents have gone to teachers, principals, superintendents. They just hold up the get out of jail free card saying this is human rights, bigot, and they shut people down. And it's only now in the last few months that people have been standing up in numbers to say this is wrong.
I'm just going to mention two things. So I think Paulo Freire is probably the most well-recognized educator. So I've been learning a little bit about Paulo Freire. I'm not going to go into detail just to mention his name, but probably the most influential like pedagogical teacher, whatever you want to call it. But the long and the short of it is all of the colleges of education, all of the teacher schools basically are steeped in this thinking that the education for children is really about raising activists. And that's the whole premise of Paulo Freire. But beyond that, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Shannon, that I actually received an email today from a member of the public, some parent who is part of the Oshawa School Board, who raised an objection with the school board over some what they perceived to be racism, anti-white racism. This person was saying that they were actually Indigenous, half Indigenous and half European, and was writing to the school. I'm not going to say which one, and a long email explaining that we feel like what you've been saying about Europeans is very anti-European, anti-white, and we feel this is racist, maybe inappropriate. Was asking for examples of when are you teaching that the bad person isn't the white person? And this email chain, and there was I think the principal got back a few weeks later, then it was months later, then months later, and just would not answer the questions. It was polite. Oh, I'm very happy that you responded to us. We're very happy to get your email. I assure you there's no racism at this school. I assure you this is all about inclusion. I assure you we're not here to do any harm. Very short responses. And that was like 8 months of to and fro and ignoring. And at the end of the email chain, this person contacted the school several times over a period of a couple of months. No response, no response, no response, no response. And so there's no accountability at all to parents. Parents are very much viewed as, they're viewed as the enemy, right? In these cases. And I think I'm starting to see more and more examples of, it's not just a feeling that I get, it's a reality. I can tell you that when I was raising my child in the UK, I was a very active member of the community. I was doing my postgraduate studies at the time, and I built a garden at his school, and his teachers were all very happy to have me teach there. I taught science. I almost became an honorary teacher. They were very happy to have me, and I was very involved. And so when I moved to Canada, one of the first things I did as a scientist and whatever, I offered to do just the same for my son's high school at the YRDSB, and I could not have had a colder response from them. So I had a feeling then, but now I keep seeing these examples over and over and over again where, no, your parent don't want you. No, don't want you.
Only the wokest get into the committees, and they protect those committees and their membership very, very closely, and censor people. I mean, there's some. I got punted from an Ottawa parents group called OCASC, Ottawa Carleton something, just last week for criticizing. What did they put up? Something about Egal Canada. Which is an activist organization and that pushes lies and hysteria, and they muted me and shut down all comments, and I was just saying, look, this is an activist organization, and maybe we shouldn't have this kind of activism infiltrating schools.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's again, it happened slowly, then it happened really fast. Because go back to about, I think it was around 2016. So I don't know if you follow Mike Nana. He did like the Evergreen thing. He did a 3-part series on Evergreen. And actually, there's a really good video called Digilante, which I think was one of his first things that he put out, but that's from a long time ago. But Mike was doing this thing on a school, like a private school in New York City, and the teachers are saying straight out, like, we want to create activists. And you'd mentioned Michael Schellenberger, and I'd spoken to him about that because Michael had gone into environmentalism. And so we spoke about when he went to college. And that's, when you mentioned the colleges of education, that's where it comes from. They're teaching you to be an activist. They're not teaching you to be an environmentalist. So you're not learning environmental science. And you're not then using your education to further your activism. Like, you're not saying, okay, I learned this in school. I learned about ecology. I learned about meteorology. I learned about the environment. I learned about what's causing all this stuff. I want to protect the earth. I'm going to go push for this stuff. I'll go join Greenpeace or whatever. So you have a bunch of people learning Saul Alinsky. It's just, copy paste. You can replace environmentalism with, I'm going to fight racism, or I'm going to fight homophobia, or I'm going to, we're going to, I don't know, pick anything. And they learn how to be an actor. They don't actually learn the field they're supposed to be going.
I can tell you that that's my understanding of the North American education system for sure, because I studied ecology and climate change and to postgraduate level in the UK. And as much as and that was 20 years ago, and as much as there was an element of teaching us to be activists. There's no doubt. Thinking back, I can see the red flags now. But I don't think it was anywhere near as bad as what I understand that to be here in North America. And in terms of it just happening all of a sudden, I was in some conversation. Well, actually, I heard a podcast with Chanel Fall and Catherine Cronus and Julia Malott just recently, where they explain. Well, Catherine Cronus was explaining that this has been in the school boards here in Canada for more than 10 years. So the gender policies, or the thinking behind that anyway. And we think that it's all of a sudden because the school boards have only committed to actually putting out those policies in writing very recently. So now that it's out there, people can read it, they're starting to twig on what's going on, and it looks like it's all happening all of a sudden, but the effects of that's been going on for quite a long time. So that's a little bit different to what you were saying.
Okay, when I said it happened really slowly, then really quickly. Okay, I can give you the history of, like I said, yeah, I'm a geek. I like, if I'm interested in something or something's bugging me and I want to find out about it, I just dive right in. So I started looking at this from all angles. So in Canada, at least 2013, probably closer to like 2011, in middle schools, you started having more of the race-based stuff. It was more of fourth wave feminism than gender and queer theory back then, but it still had that power, like power and privilege, that kind of talk, like oppressor and oppressed. And you had some of the gender stuff. I mean, even back in like 2014, I think in BC, was it 2014 or 15? You could have just walked in to a doctor's office, said, like I could have walked into I'm a woman now. I get a letter, go get my driver's license changed. That was, like I said, around 2015. So yeah, this has been building up. I'm not discounting that this has been there for a while. I mean, in the States, they started before us because this is all American. This came, like, CRT came out of American jurisprudence.
Entirely American.
Yeah, and that's what I laugh at when I hear like Trudeau or say, oh, they're using American politics. I'm like, you're basing your race policy on American
Wokeism is American, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you could blame the French a bit too, because like Foucault and Derrida.
Well, the very unique woke flavor that we have now is 100% American.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like, that's part of the thing that I think is a problem in Canada is, I don't know if you remember this, Shannon, or either yourself, but I remember in the 80s there was this joke that went around, the only thing Canadians are proud of is that they're not Americans. And that kind of got ingrained. And so now, like, all Trudeau has to say, oh, that's American politics. Canadians clap like trained seals.
Yeah.
And or maybe not so much anymore, but that was at that point. So it was kind of like, especially when Trump came in, it's like, oh, we can't be like Trump. So we're going to jump on this garbage. And,
then why be more woke than the wokest country in the world then? That doesn't make sense to me. I am very confused by the Canadian habit of like attaching itself to these odd stereotypes, which oddly happen to all be Quebecois, like poutine and tuk and like, I don't know. And this idea, certainly I have that in my family where, yeah, if it's American, we hate it. Yeah, we're nothing like Americans, and having to tell the entire world we're Canadian, we're not American. Like anyone cares except for a Canadian. So why then become even more woke than the most woke? I don't know. You explain that to me.
I couldn't tell you. Like, the whole Canadians are nice and Canadians are, blah, blah, blah. They're nice and they're kind.
I'm going to come here and say that is not true. Okay. As someone who, like, first of all, came from a French Canadian family, speak their mind pretty loud, speak with their hands all over the place. I would not put that in a nice category. I would put that in a more direct and maybe slightly snobby category.
Okay.
Then I come here in the GTA. I think, okay, apparently Canadians are nice. I tell you what, I did not find them nice. I found them like and maybe this is the wokeness talking. One of the first signs I had was people were kind of friendly, like they would respond to you with a politeness, like they would say please and thank you and respond to your question. But actually, the most cold people I've ever encountered beyond that.
Yeah,
so I would not call that nice.
I was just talking about the stereotype and everything, but then
it is incorrect.
But if you ever took a look at, I don't know if you've read Kindly Inquisitors by John Farrow, and he talks about the humanitarian threat to liberal science. And that's what this is. So like when he discusses the enlightenment, calls it like liberal science and the humanitarian threat. And he was writing about the 90s in the universities. And it's, don't you want to fight racism? Don't you want to fight homophobia? How can you? And so you're pulling on people's good nature. So I think
You're talking
that,
about weaponizing empathy.
yeah, pretty much. And that's what it was doing. And it's,
Well, I'll tell you what, I do find Canadians have a real distaste for conflict. There's no doubt about that, especially of the English sort or the Anglophone sort. And so I think there is an element of that, right? Weaponizing this desire not to want to have any kind of conflict, plus mix that politeness on top of that. So people just don't want to engage with this idea, right? And then you throw in the idea of you start accusing people of all these horrible things. I think you're onto something, absolutely. Because the thing about the UK is that there's an element of that in UK, sure. But there's a lot more people who are much more willing to actually just be very direct, a la like me. So that's much more common. And I don't know if it's because of where I live. I mean, I understood culturally that the GTA had a reputation for being quite cold and not genuine. So maybe it's just where I live. But yeah, I certainly pick that up from here. I still do even now. Now I can have conversations with people. I can go to the gym and talk to people there and talk about this wokeness stuff a little bit. And most people agree, but people don't want to overstep. They don't want to get involved. Generally speaking, obviously in my, I guess, more activist circles, that's not true because these are the people rising up and maybe a bit more brave. But on an everyday level, yeah, Canadians, they don't want to get involved at all.
yeah, I mean, but I think that's not just a Canadian thing. I think most people, um, this is
There's a
this is
very
from a
Canadian
talk.
flavor to that.
No, but this was a talk from Douglas Murray. He was talking about it was at the 10th anniversary of the Danish cartoon thing, and he said like if you look back throughout history, freedom was never really a popular idea. It was only a small number of people that pushed it. Everyone just wants to get along with their lives and earn a living and come home and whatever, relax and you know
Mm.
that's it. That's what they're working. That's what most people want. And standing up to this stuff, especially the climate we're in, you are putting yourself at risk. You are putting
Yeah.
your job at risk. You're putting your livelihood at risk.
But you have to.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is one thing that I talk about a lot because I don't know what it is that compels me. But when I really understood what I understood, I felt absolutely compelled to reach out to people. I needed to reach out to people. I needed to find people that understood where I was coming from. And I did. I was very lucky. I went to the auto protest on June 9th and I happened to find a group of people. And as luck would have it, I don't know, it's fate or whatever, found these people and have been working with them ever since. But I was compelled to do that. And I agree with you. I think maybe it's not just a Canadian thing. There's certainly a Canadian flavor to it, but it's not just Canadian. People do want to go about their daily lives. But I'm doing these podcasts and I'm doing this work beyond just having empathy for other parents and having it happen to my own family. But it's also because if we just keep doing that, if we just keep allowing things to pass us by because we just want to pay our bills, we just want to, we just want to have a happy life, we just want to ignore it, the thing doesn't go away. It just gets worse. One thing you hear all the time is I'm not going to be able to feed my family. Well, I'm here to say I have had 3 careers in my life. And I gave up a very lucrative one that but was very woke. and you can find other work. You can put yourself in a position that you can speak out, you can do things, right? And I think a lot of people find reasons not to. They find reasons not to stand up and say things. Now look, there's a lot of people who do, but I would like to see more people find the courage to be able to actually act against it, because you don't have to do much. And that's what I'm realizing. You just have to do something. A lot of people say that they want action, they want things to change, but when it comes down to it, I'm not actually seeing a lot of people do things.
I mean, I worked for government for 5 years. I was working for the government up in northern Quebec, and I was extremely vocal against at that point it was more like the racism stuff, but I was also vocal against Islam, which is a big no-no. At the federal level, you had M103 when Trudeau first came into power. I spoke out against that. So I was just always, I had friends, like one of my friends says, oh, well, I work for the government. You work at the liquor board. Like I'm working in the government. Like it just there's a different
Let me
thing.
let me tell you a little story. I'm just going to add a little story,
Mm,
okay? And this is I still haven't fully processed how this is even possible. I was invited to Richard Bilkstow's memorial, and I went. And at his I thought maybe I'd be a bit uncomfortable. I didn't know his family, his friends, although I did know some people through Lighthouse or whatever. So I thought, okay, I'll go. And I went and I sat at a table, and the person sitting next to me was Richard's high school friend. And so we got talking about Richard, and she was telling me that Richard was very, very brave. So Richard is a principal that, took his own life
yep.
recently because of some of the DI policies. And this friend was telling me how brave Richard was and how she wishes she was like Richard. And these DI policies are so terrible, and don't you wish we could get rid of them, and so on and so forth. And she was telling me how she'd been into a session recently, but of course she couldn't speak up because she was white and she'd be called racist. And my heart sank. And I speak my mind. I cannot help it. It's got me in a lot of trouble in my life. And I turned to this lady and I said, well, why didn't you speak up? And she said, well, you know what it's like. They're going to call me racist and I'd lose my job. And I said, you're at Richard's memorial telling me how brave he was, and you're telling me you could not say something in that meeting? And this woman turned around and did not speak to me for the rest of the evening, because it infuriates me. It infuriates me to hear these things, that people want someone else to do the work all the time. And they will go on and on. And look, I'm really sorry, lady, that you're Richard's friend, but if you're listening to this podcast, but no, I did not. I was left with a very, very bad taste in my mouth, because that's what I'm finding is that how do you inspire people to speak up? Because if we just say, oh well, I'll have a consequence, it's okay for them to have a consequence, and that's great, they're heroes, bravo, but I can't do that. And I keep coming across that over and over, and I just don't know how to inspire people and engage people to realize that the fear of that consequence is far, far, far worse than the actual consequence.
Oh yeah, 100%. Shannon, I want to ask you about this because you said you
Mm-hmm.
ran for school board, and this is something like I've done some work with FAIR, and this is one of the things that FAIR was trying to do in the U.S. was to get people in the school board, in any kind of administration role. And if you get it enough, like you don't even need a majority, you need roughly about 20 to 25%. And then you start pushing the colleges of education. You say, nope, we don't want these teachers. Like you cut off the demand for that at that point. So either they have to try to push in some new kind of regulation, or they have to adapt if they want their, I mean, let's just look at it really bluntly, and it's like the teachers are their product, they're selling their product. So if they're not putting out a good product, they're going to go under. So what do you think about something like that? Do you think that has even a chance of working, or do you
Oh,
think that's like way
well,
too long
we
term?
have to think long term
Okay,
about
fair.
this. This didn't arrive overnight. I work in the money business. Warren Buffett says the hangover is always proportional to the party the night before.
Mhm.
And it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of dedicated people to turn this around. And my call, I made a speech on Parliament Hill on the 20th, was to my fellow people in Ottawa, is that we need to organize at a grassroots level. We need to take names. We need to educate parents. We need to find and cultivate leadership and candidates that will run in these school boards, and we need to be able to win. We need to take them back. And some people are ahead of this. Now, I've talked to teachers all over Canada, and I won't say where, but I know that there are teachers who have specifically and kind of under the radar taken back the union leaderships in their local union locals in recent elections. They have quietly talked amongst themselves. I don't know how they figure out coded language, like, there's a wink that I'm not woke. But they have gathered and they've whipped up enough people to vote and put them in positions of leadership in the unions to stop some of this stuff. Other teachers I know have deliberately sought out the positions of diversity, equity, inclusion leads in their schools in order to basically sabotage the efforts, right? So there is what do they call it? Quiet quitting. So
Mhm.
quiet quitting on woke, and yeah, I think that it's not only important. I think it's possible. I think the work has to start now. I've spoken with, I spoke to Preston Manning about this last year at a conference that I met him at, and there is a recognition in the Conservative Party at provincial and federal levels that they're not putting enough energy into developing a ground game, a grassroots game, and that school boards, because they've kind of abandoned them, haven't put emphasis on them. That's part of the reason why they're at where they're at. And so there is a cohort of people in the conservative movement that recognize this and that are willing to put effort into it. That means training candidates, helping them with lists, and teaching them how to door knock, how to fundraise, how to do all this stuff. But it's a process that takes time. And in the meantime, the argument that Scott Moe is making next week, he's the premier of Saskatchewan, about exercising the notwithstanding clause, is that this situation of secret transition in schools going on is causing harm the longer it goes on. So we're stopping it now. Unfortunately, we can't do that unless we have serious political reckoning and awakening where those politicians are putting a foot down and saying no more of this. So in lieu of that, we have to put the game together. We've got to run candidates, and we've got to take these boards back.
You need the politicians. Like, this is one of the things I've been talking to a couple of okay, I'm not in favor of the government coming into the schools. K through 12 is one thing, but I believe in academic freedom. At the same point, I'm like, okay, the academy didn't live up to its end of the bargain. So
it doesn't believe in academic freedom.
Yeah, I don't trust it. There are some academics that are being pushing back against a lot of this stuff since the 90s, and I respect them. But it's like, okay, at this point, I don't trust the academy to take care of this themselves. You're going to need legislation. And this is one and only time I'm actually kind of grateful for the notwithstanding clause. I mean, I told someone this in 2015 that I said, because I had actually had the misfortune of meeting Trudeau a couple of times. And I was like, there's no way I'm voting for a party that has him as a leader. And, I spoiled my ballot in 2015. And I said, if any party had come up, any leaders said, first thing we're going to do is get rid of the notwithstanding clause, I was like, I'll vote for them. Because for me, that was like, that's a huge hole in our Charter of Rights. If you actually read the clause, it gets rid of Section 2. I'm forgetting all of the sections, but it gets rid of like Section 2, 4, 11, and 17, I believe. Well, there might be a couple others, but Section 2 is where you have all your individual liberties. So freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And so you can override that with the notwithstanding clause for 5 years. And I'm like, okay, that's a huge hole in the Charter of Rights. It should be gone. I'm actually glad at this moment in time it's there, that like you can use that to push back on some of the stuff. Look, I realize I'm going a little over time, and I don't want to keep you guys too long. But if you're here if your guys are good, I'm good to talk. But like, I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I'd mentioned
your mic is a little bit jittery, but I'm happy.
Likewise.
I told you, like, I go back to I mentioned the Islam thing again. And here's my word of warning, and take it with a grain of salt. Okay, first of all, I'm going to give you like the really, really horrific stuff first. Is any movement that is sided with Islam. Okay, and this is in Muslim countries. It's not, but if you speak to Oscar Nomani in the States and you read her book, Woke Army, about what happened in the US, you can also see it there. But any movement that sided with Islam, eventually Islam turned on that movement. So, perfect example that I can give you is, Iraq and Iran. Both the Baathists were communist, and the Iranian Revolution would not have happened if it wasn't for communist students. As soon as the Iranian Revolution succeeded, they killed off all the communists that helped. The Baathists did the same thing in Iraq. If you go down to Syria and Libya, similar things happened, even though Syria and Libya during the Cold War were allied with the Soviets more so than the United States. Like I said, that's the really extreme. I'm not saying that Muslims in Canada are going to be doing that here, but I have no problem. Like, I've spoken out against, Islamic homophobia. If you want to do that. There's 13 Muslim countries that death penalty for homosexuality. Iran and Pakistan, if they find a gay or lesbian couple, they give them a choice. One of you dies, or both of you die, or one of you. A lot of places here in the West, like the Code Pink and Pink News, those other things, we're praising them for being progressive for free transitions or surgery. Take that wherever you want. So all I'm saying is, with the Islam thing, be very careful. If you're going to have a protest, this protest is about protecting kids, and that's what it's about. It's not about you burning, and it's not because I don't want people to burn flags. It's not about burning the LGBT,
No.
the original Pride flag. It's not about slurs against homosexuals.
Let me
It's
tell
here
you,
because
I absolutely know exactly what you're talking about, because there is no doubt that there is homophobia, like actual homophobia, within some of the Muslims. Like, I'm just going to be real direct. I've had a problem with it. I've said things from the very beginning. But there's a difficult choice to be made too, because on the one hand, so for the march, okay, so there's lots of different kinds of Canadians, and there was certainly a lot of issues with some of the more extreme Muslim positions with some of the more secular or moderate people. There was a lot of conflict, and we, I guess, as a collective of people across the country, kind of decided that we were all just going to push for this march. And it's not a march that's led by any particular group, although some groups may put a stamp on it and say that they're leading it, but there's certainly a large Muslim contingent in that. But there was a decision to be made, because do you simply not do the marches at all because there's homophobia, and that was raised several times, or do you do it anyway and try to be louder and unite over this one particular thing? And that's what the decision that was made, and it turns out to be an absolutely successful march, and it's going to happen again. And so I think people are very aware of that danger. There's no doubt about that. And it's certainly strange bedfellows. Some of the more extremist elements, I think, are sort of imploding on itself at the minute, which was maybe to be inevitable. But there may be other issues as well. I don't think, I'm certainly not blind to that. But, there was a mission there. And I think so for example, right now there's still concern over some of that homophobia. So some groups are maybe a little bit more hesitant because it does exist.
I should say that
is there.
I've talked with people from Christian groups all across Canada, and there's some fairly substantial ones. And homophobia is the appropriate term. There is and some people are able to couch it in a reasonable language. They say, adultery is a sin, and drinking in excess is a sin, and stealing is a sin, and homosexuality, we believe, is a sin, and it's no different than any other sin. People sin. Okay, so that's
hate the sin and not the sin.
And I think that's an evolved perspective. If we're just talking about a religious framework, epistemology of the world, and nevertheless, it's an easy target, and sometimes the ignorance is distasteful. When I hear people say certain things about gays and lesbians, or in the Christian community, they can't differentiate between anyone and the rainbow. They don't recognize that. I've spent some time, letting people know that a lot of the LGBT community is at very significant odds with the TQ, and it's the TQ that's causing the problem.
Yeah.
Whereas, the simple, let's call it the mass awareness, or the simple low information awareness, is that it's all coming from the rainbow, and everyone associated is bad.
Yeah.
And I think you were talking about this earlier, about potential blowback. A lot of people in the gay and lesbian community are very concerned about blowback, about things coming back, and overcompensating in the other direction, and have, I believe, reason for concern.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I'm not trying to say don't align with Muslims, don't align with Christians, or it's just like, be aware of what you're getting into. And I mean, I'd spoken with Julia and Catherine a while back, and I told them both the same. It was the night of the lighthouse thing in Toronto. I told them both the same thing. I said, just lay out what your protest is about in very clear terms, and say, if you want to deviate from that, you're free to protest separately. We can't stop you, but you're not part of ours. So
I think the simple thing, the simple thing here is that there's so the whole March situation is lots of people doing their own thing. So it's so grassroots. It's literally the grass growing. I've heard that, so I'm going to steal it and share it. So there are a lot of Muslim groups, and even in those Muslim groups, there'll be some who are more headstrong in thinking the entire rainbow is exactly the same, and TQ, the trans and queer, is not separate. And there's others who are more willing to understand that the LGB is a bit different. So there's a wide variety in their groups there, but people are aligning with who they're more comfortable aligning with, and that's sort of happening organically because I feel that there is an awareness of that. I think it would be unfortunate not to go forward with the momentum of this kind of movement because of that, because I think there's a benefit to everyone else who isn't thinking that way to also rise up and drown out that message, because it is a minority, and unfortunately it's a minority that gets a lot of attention because it is a stance that is not shared by the vast majority of Canada, which is very, very distasteful. But I would say that the people in my network, we are very aware, but you can't, it's very difficult to have the united message that you're talking about doing their own thing across the board. There's no centralized control saying this is what we're doing.
It was like throwing a match on dry tinder. All someone had to do was set a date, and Melanie and I were in that meeting, and us among others pushed the original organizer. You need a date. You're saying all these things and you're going to do this, so let's just set a date. Tell people when the date is. People will show up. It's like if you build it, they will come, and that's what happened.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah.
But okay, so kind of sticking with this, like it's the religious thing, because I was looking at this when I started reading it. The Calvinist aspect of it really, I mean, it was right there, especially when you read about things like whiteness. You hear people talking about, I don't want to be consumed by whiteness. And the whole idea of total depravity. And then when the gender stuff really started coming to the fore, more so than the race stuff, something kind of clicked in my head. It's like, okay, so they use CRT-based curriculum to tell you that you're either oppressed or oppressor. So if you're white, you've got original sin. You're always going to be racist. There's no way you can get around it just by the fact that you're white. You are a racist. Even if you never say or do anything racist in your life, that's your identity. And then, why are especially young white girls transitioning so much? It's, well, if you were trans or if you were non-binary or if you're queer, you were always that. So if you're always that way, you were always oppressed, therefore no longer a sinner. So that's your road to absolution. And so that's, you start them really young. And then, by the time they finish primary school and start going to middle school, they're primed to just take on whatever it is to get them out of it. I mean, I don't know if you heard about the Dalton School in New York City, and this was one of the first ones that got really publicized. So this was in 2015. I think it's at that point it was like $40,000 or $45,000 a year. It's a K through 8 academy. So they took kids from grade 3 to grade 8, split them up into quote unquote affinity groups, 45 minutes a week. They told all the white kids, you're oppressors. You've kept everyone down. They sent letters home to the parents. How does your child, identify racially, especially like if they're a mixed race? And then they were told all the other kids, you're oppressed. So they had, an Asian group, they had a black kids group, they had a Hispanic group. You're oppressed. It's whitey that did all this to you. Within a few months, you had these little kids talking like ethno-nationalists, because little kids being little kids, and I'll go do some research. They went online and they started looking up like, what's good about my race? What's bad about this race? And then, they start falling into these rabbit holes. And to this day, that school still has huge, huge racial problems. And they're just, oh, well, we need more DEI.
Yeah, that's the answer to everything. More
more
wokeness, more progressivism. Yeah. Oh, yeah, these problems are caused by white supremacy, like open drug use in the streets and looting and vandalism, and so we need to double down. And it just it keeps going and going.
But this is the narcissism that you were talking about, Shannon, because the seduction of that kind of thinking, that it's always someone else's fault, that you don't have to take responsibility for your own feelings, that you can externalize all of the responsibility for your life, for your feelings, for everything, is the narcissism, right? But we're dressing that up as something else. We're dressing it up and weaponizing other people's empathy by calling it oppression. And turning that into a religion, and it really is a lot of this brainwashing that you were talking about. That's what I see when I read these stories, and I think I'm vaguely aware of that story. I think I might have actually listened to it on one of your podcasts, because I was going through some of your podcasts.
Yeah, I've talked to it before, but yeah, it's. I mean, but it's nutty. Like there's okay, the stuff that
I think
stems
we
from.
need to come back to a place where I mean, this is just my thoughts, but I think we need to find space where we can start talking about what makes us fulfilled and truly happy human beings. Like back to basic stuff, right? The stuff that I tried to raise my child with, that now would probably be called extreme right-wing conspiracy thoughts, like where you have a duty to those you love and they have a duty to you, and you are conscientiousness, treating people with decency and respect, and having the same in return, like those super basic things. Like I think that that's the only antidote to this indoctrination. But whether or not we're able to do that, I don't know. I question that all the time. I don't know if I could do that with my own child. So I don't know.
Okay, when I first got back from overseas, my first thing is we got something's wrong with universities, that's going to be fixed. But now it's like, okay, we need to fix the K through 12 as well, because if you don't fix that, so even up until about school, I think Jonathan Haidt talks about this 2012,
Magic year.
2013. That's when, yeah, that's when it went from, you know, administration led protest type of thing. Right? Like it was before any of the protests in like Berkeley and stuff like that. In the 60s, it was the students. And but around 2012 or so, it was the administration that started leading stuff. And it was them that pushed the students into it. But now that you've got that, just reinforced itself. So now you have both students and administrators. And so like I said, if you can fix universities, but if you don't watch out, the kids graduating are going to be coming in and they're already in that mindset.
Yeah, but you're talking from the perspective of someone who doesn't have a child. So
Yeah.
there's more than, so children experience more than the school, and certainly they spend a lot of time there. And look, I'm not saying, I think there's a really part to play for families too, like to recognize that. Okay, so I used to think the concept of family values was extreme right, and it was very this American cool, doolally kind of idea. But I'm starting to come around to the idea that we do need to rethink this idea of instilling those kinds of family values and strength within the family, because that's what's being lost. And when children are well rooted in loving families, there's much more of a barrier between them and being indoctrinated in this way, right? There's like an inoculation, if you will. And so I get what you're trying to say, but I think it really begins at home in families, because schools only play a certain part. And if your child is left vulnerable because they didn't have the necessary foundation, then they're much more vulnerable. And I can honestly say that looking back, I could have done a lot more to instill more inoculation into my child had I understood the situation. So, I mean, yeah, there is a part to play in the politics and the school boards and all this stuff. Absolutely. But we also need to talk about how we can encourage people to strengthen their own families as well.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm not going to argue with you there at all. And I'm not saying that school is the only thing that you're getting this through. You can take all the quotes you want. You can go back to Aristotle, like give me the child until he's 7, and I'll show you the man. You know, you can take other quotes. I mean, like I know Moms for Liberty got a bit of a problem in the States because they quoted Hitler. But I mean, there's a Hitler quote that I use all the time about this. It's from Mein Kampf. It's like when an enemy comes to me and says, I don't stand in your camp. I don't care. You're a material. Like I have your children. Your children are now in my camp. So that's what that matters. So, you know, the reason I get on the schools is because, especially with social media and everything, they hear about something in schools, they'll go online, they'll talk to their friends, they'll find, chat rooms and, message. I'm showing my, like they'll find boards, they'll find YouTube channels, they'll find all kinds of resources, that'll, Reddit communities and whatever, that'll reinforce that. So if you don't have a strong family life, and that goes back to what I was originally talking about, is they've made it so hard for families to do that because
Yes.
parents are so, you've you can't leave your kids alone. You can't let your kids go out and play all day so that mom and dad can sit around and, plan out a budget, talk about what they're going to do, whatever. Just like you don't have that.
Yeah.
You're
So
running
let me
around
tell you
continuously.
another story. I just interviewed a parent recently for the Resilience podcast. And at the end of the conversation, sometimes I continue speaking to the parents. And I ended up speaking to her. And she was explaining to me that it was so, and this child comes from a very, very, very loving family. And this person is lifelong NDP, not just supporter, but active in the NDP, affirmed her child, all this stuff, and still got treated like a bigot, and the secrets were kept from her. And that's the whole podcast is that it doesn't matter if you're left or right, or even if you affirm to no end, you're still going to get treated in this way. Anyway, that's not the story. The story is, at the end, she was saying, what kind of future are we setting these kids up with when they're being told that parents are inherently abusive? Right? If they go to their friends, they go to the school, if they go all over anywhere and they say, well, my mom was really mean to me, and like, well, it's because your mom's abusive. And she was saying that when she was growing up, that no matter how difficult she had it at home, no matter what argument that she had, if she went to a teacher or a babysitter or any other kind of adult, that adult would always tell her, well, look, your mother loves you. Your mother loves you more than anyone else in the world. And I know that you're having a difficult time right now, but trust me, your mother loves you. And she was explaining to me that really she didn't appreciate it at the time because obviously you're a teenager and you think, no, she doesn't. My mom's stupid. But she said that she internalized that message and she knew that her mother loved her. And she was saying, what are we doing to our children when we're telling our children, your parents don't love you, they're abusive? Even when they're doing all the things that you're supposed to do to be the parent that, the affirming parent, the woke parent, all of this stuff. And that really struck a chord with me. Because you're right, we can do more within families for sure. And I think that's an important thing because I believe in accountability. But it is not helped when all of the entire society that these children are surrounded by are giving you this message that your family is shit and you shouldn't be in it.
Yeah. I mean, like that kind of messaging and stuff. Even that to some extent, like I'll go back to 80s television and stuff. And you know, it was always just like a running gag. I mean, you had the loving families and whatever you can talk about. Like look at the shows like Family Ties or the Cosby Show and stuff like that. But you still had that running gag of, you know, oh, my wife nags me, or my husband's useless. Like you had those kind of jokes, and it just got progressively. That message got progressively stronger and stronger and stronger. So you had that, and then I call it like Gen X at one point. I know you're millennial, but I Gen X. I'd say like
Well,
we're a
identify as a Gen X. It's
uh,
okay.
yeah, we're the after school special generation, and maybe that's why we took those after school specials too much to heart, and maybe that's why we became so paranoid when you put in policies for kids. And so like,
Well,
because
it's
I
the
remember,
boogeyman. I call it the
yeah,
boogeyman, right? This idea of the in the past where kids could actually get kicked out from their home for being homosexual. Well, I use that word now for some reason. So yeah, for being gay, right? That did happen. They could get beat up by their parents. We all have stories of even being beaten up at school. Like that was a thing that did happen in the 90s and in the 80s. I do remember
yeah,
that.
oh yeah, no,
But that changed over time. And for some reason, that boogeyman
It didn't just
remained. So
remain,
this
it
idea
got
now,
bigger and scarier
it
and
got
uglier,
worse.
right? And more paranoid. One of the things we haven't talked about, you mentioned 80s TV shows. Um, One of the things that really shifted over time was the portrayal of boys and young men. And it's now, uh, in order to advance girls, because the argument from the radical feminists was that we've got patriarchy and we've got these uneven outcomes, we have to actually suppress boys. boys in the school
Yeah.
system for a very long time have been treated like defective girls. And the before this, gender ideology came in, radical feminism was in schools, and it was infiltrating the environment. I mean, I came onto this whole thing in terms of awareness in the late aughts, maybe 9, 10, when I was in a contentious divorce. And I went online to try and find resources because my ex was playing custody games and legal games and like really running me through the meat grinder. And then I encountered pushback in forums and chat rooms for I was called a rapist and a misogynist, and like they changed the language now. It's white supremacy, but at the time, the argument coming from 2012, 2013, we started seeing this rape culture argument on university campuses, that we live in a rape culture, and all boys need to be taught not to rape people. And before the confession of privilege was the Frosh Week mandatory training for all young men, that you have to go and take this and certify yourself to not be a rapist, right? Like we've just distorted reality around these things, and boys really live with a sense of shame coming through the education system. And part of that, I think, is lots of people have argued that feminism was one of the leading contributors to this mess that we're in with gender, and feminists hate to hear that. But
I, as a woman, I would like to underline how true that is, and how I've seen that shame show itself within my own child. And I think I think we need to say it. And I think as a woman, I need to agree with you very, very strongly on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever read Christine Hoff Sommers' book,
yep.
The War on Boys. Yeah, and then if you look at the stats now, like more women are going to universities, like the degrees and all that. And then when you point out places like Sweden, probably one of the most egalitarian places, women, when they have the choice, still don't go into engineering or computer science or this like the hardcore STEM fields. Right? Like it's when they have that choice, they choose to go into something that they like better. I'm not saying better suited for or whatever, just they like better, so they'll go into that. And when you bring that up again, you're sexist, you're misogynistic, you're upholding the picture, sense. Again, like I said, I don't want to keep you both you so too much longer, but one last thing I want to talk about before we go is, this is one of my bugbears about all this stuff. So when first it was the CRT stuff, there's no CRT in the curriculums. You spent so much time arguing about whether or not there's CRT in the curriculum. You didn't talk about, I mean, I have better stats for the US than for Canada for whatever reason. The stats in Canada are much harder to find, but in the States, I think nationwide, it's gotten worse. But at one point, it was like, I think pre-COVID, it was something like 65% couldn't do math at grade level, and 75% nationally couldn't read at grade level. I'm like, that's the problem. Problem's not whether or not the curriculum is CRT. Okay, that's secondary. I mean, you can argue whether or not that curriculum will help these kids read and do math. That's a valid argument, but you spend so much time on the secondary argument with this nonsense. Spend so much time on, no, that's not CRT, or gender stuff isn't in the curriculum, but it's in the schools, it's being taught. The focus of the schools should be, can these kids read? Can they do math?
But that's not the point of a Freirean education.
Oh,
The point of a Freirean education is to produce more Freirean education, right?
I get it, but that's what I mean. Like, we've lost focus on what the argument is. You've gotten away from, okay, this is what schools should be doing, and now I see it. Now I see it coming back in a lot of the protests. Either in Canada or the US, it's like, we want our kids to read and write and do math. We don't care about all that. So I think in that aspect of the lockdowns, that helped that. But so I want to see where you guys fit in on that. Like, where you think, like, how bad is Canada compared to the States? I know some stats just come out of Ontario, so I don't know if you have any kind of numbers or figures on that.
I don't know about numbers. We have our own flavors of critical race theory, the whole decolonization narrative, and the you know,
Mm.
theft of indigenous land and genocidal and history and all of those things. And you can't argue that that's not being taught in schools because it's embedded in everything. But just like the curriculum versus the policies on the gender stuff, that's the division in Canadian schools. It's between the curriculum and policy. Feminist ideology isn't taught in schools, but the feminist teachers treat people based on their radical feminist views, and
Yeah.
they act within that
It's the
framework.
difference between theory
Yeah.
and praxis, right? So what the theory is and what the application of that theory is, and this is all
Yeah.
a distraction.
I will say, like, okay, we've talked about a lot of frightening things. I will say that and people have different opinions on this, but there was a Bill 98 that passed in Ontario, an education bill reform in the beginning, end of spring, beginning of summer. And one of the first implementations is that Stephen Lecce has created a circumstance where schools and school boards have mandatory reporting about who the external trainers are coming in for professional development for teachers. So there's no veil of secrecy on this anymore. It's not, you don't need FOIA. The schools are going to have to put this up. And at the same time, he overlaid this idea that we want to focus on math, reading, and writing and skills. And when you compare the two, here's the objective: math, writing, reading, and skills versus what's being taught to teachers to teach to children in this policy environment, and they just don't line up. And so it gives a structure for accountability. And I know a lot of people in who are really active in this area, people who ran for school trustee like I did, who are cynical on this. For me, the jury's kind of out. I'm hopeful that this has an impact because it opens up that box and it ends the argument. If we're focused on improving math, reading, writing, and skills, then why the hell are teachers and unions and boards all focused on DEI?
And one more positive point to end on is that it's a small number of people, the most radical activists, the zealots who have got us in this position, admittedly over a long period of time, but it's a small minority of people. And all it takes is a small minority of people to completely change the culture. And right now, there is equally small yet substantially growing minority of defiant objectors who are working diligently in their own networks, who are intelligent, capable people who have just as much energy as some of the most radicals on the other side to actually make a difference. And so, there is absolute there's potential for things to change for the positive in the future is what I'm saying. It's the feeling that I get as much as I complain. I'd like everyone to stand up, but it's really heartening to see that there absolutely are many people who are doing something about it. So that's my positive end note.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's good to hear. Like I just like to turn this around. I mean, I don't really want to read another CRT paper or some more gender theory because it's mind numbing. So, if I can go back to just making fart jokes and just sit around with my buddies and watch hockey, I'd be happy.
That'll be the time for the slippers and the cigar.
Have you read a book called
Exactly.
The Fourth Turning? You come across it? Okay, it's
Nope.
written by, we're talking about Gen X and millennials. These are a couple of guys who really focused on the study of the culture of generations and these different divides between the silent generation, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and where we're at now. And they lay out an idea that about every 80 years or so, societies go through a crisis. And part of it is because, the silent generation, they got through the Second World War. They're the parents of the baby boomers. They suffered the Great Depression, the stock market crash, high unemployment. My grandparents arrived in the prairies in the dirty 30s. They called it the Dust Bowl. Like there was a drought and it was really, really hard living. And because of that hard living, surviving war and conflict and famine and hardship, people became very disciplined. And that discipline and that rigor established itself, and that each generation successively has rebelled against it. So the baby boomers pushed back against their parents, the silent generation, to become more liberal, and some of that was good, right? The rights movement in the '60s, and the ending of segregation, and all of that. The gay liberation movement, we really transformed society with some of that rebellion against very, very conservative rigidity. But each generation that has come has degenerated. And this 80-year cycle, or 4 generations, or the fourth turning, is where we're at right now. These guys who wrote this book in the '90s predicted that in the mid-20s we would be at the peak of the crisis, which is where we are now.
Yeah. But I mean, you always have that. There's a saying,
That's right.
Good times, good men. I hope we're not too far gone that we can turn this around, because
Well, I will work till my dying bed to make sure that that's not the case.
yeah, same here. Like
promise.
I will, so here's my thing on this. Like, so my family immigrated to Canada when I was 6. Now, I'm not claiming racism or anything here, but especially back in Montreal in the '70s when we moved here, my dad, he looked at where my aunts and uncles were living, and he's like, I'm not living here. He goes, I didn't leave India to come to Canada to live in Little India, because the South Shore of Montreal was starting to get ghettoized, and there was a lot of South Asians. So we moved to Nuns Island, which was pretty much just white Canadians. And in my school, I think there was a handful of kids who weren't white. So there was always a feeling of, okay, you're not the same. And I had a lot of good friends. I'm not saying anyone was like, yeah, there were some racist idiots, but I picked up the values that were being taught and talked about. And go back to India for a visit. I've always had happy feet. So I'd save up all my money and I'd go traveling and stuff. And I'd come back to Canada and appreciate it. So I glommed onto those values. And so when I talk about those values, like the values mean, like, so individual freedoms, my right to speak, my right to believe what I want to believe, and, all my individual rights. I believed in that. I believed everyone had those. So for me, what's happening now is like, no, I'm sorry, this is completely counter to what I was taught. This is completely counter to what this country was supposed to be built on. And I'm going to fight I'm going to fight for those rights, for those liberties. That's what I want. And it's, everyone has their own upbringing or whatever, but my upbringing made it so that I would not give those up. And I mean, before I went overseas, social media wasn't really a thing. I don't even think MySpace was around back then, because I went overseas in 2002, I believe. And so, there was ICQ and things like that, but there was no real social media. And when I came back, I was like, what the hell happened? And it was, that's when I said, okay, I thought it was an Islam thing. I thought, okay, people aren't educated. I'll speak out about Islam and educate them. I didn't realize, it was only when I started digging deep into it, saw how messed up it was. I said, you are going against these rights. Anyway, like I said, I should let you guys go. If you want to let people know where they can find you, if you want to also send me the links to your podcasts, I'll put them in the descriptions. Yeah, so please go ahead.
Well, I have not memorized the URL. By the way, thank you for sharing that. You're not the first person that's actually shared a very similar story about coming to Canada, actually, on my space. Oh, I also have Twitter Spaces every Tuesday at 7. I am Finkel Dusty. Do not ask where that comes from. It does not come from anywhere. I am Finkel Dusty on Twitter. If you're interested in coming to a space where you can talk about these woke issues, especially gender issues, or talk about these marches coming up, we talk about that a lot, news, etc. I do that every Tuesday at 7 Eastern. But I also have, with Our Duty Canada, we have our YouTube channel. Just search for Our Duty Canada, it'll come up, but you have to write Canada because Our Duty has multiple chapters across the world. But yeah, you can check us out on there.
I,
Yeah, thanks.
you can
Shannon, if
find
you want
me.
to know.
My legal name is Shannon Boschy, but I go by Shannon B. Douglas on Twitter. I've been using that as a pen name for a number of years, and it was useful when I was anonymous. But I'm open about who I am now. I and Melanie co-host the weekly Canadian Gender Wars report on Sunday afternoons. We've switched to a live format recently, and we're constantly improving and learning from what we're doing. We cover the biggest stories in the gender space across Canada and education. And I mean, this week's going to be huge. We'll talk about Megan Murphy. We'll talk about this thing in Ottawa. We'll talk about BC legislature. Tons of stuff up to date that people can track, as well as what's coming up with the marches on the 21st of October. I occasionally write for the Woke Watch Canada newsletter, published by James Pugh. That's a sort of within arm's length of the Lighthouse Network. And James does some really awesome stuff there. So you want to check out that Substack. And in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be publishing some work about artificial intelligence research and the gender culture online. I'm doing my annual review. We contracted a big AI firm a year ago to do some research, and been working with some big names in the space, psychotherapists and medical doctors and things like that are consulting to the project. So keep an eye out for that. That's called APISC, Digital Research Foundation. Adolescent Peer Influence and Social Contagion is the acronym.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you both for coming on. It was great talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you.
And
Thanks for having us.
thanks everyone for listening.